Howdy, gang, and welcome once again to the Duct Tape Studios. I'm Jeff McAleer, your host here at the Gaming Gang channel. Thanks for joining me once again. Before I dive into today's review, I do want to remind you if you enjoy the Gaming Gang and would like to support the outlet, you can do so in a few ways. First, by utilizing our affiliate code for the One Bookshelf sites, such as Drive-Thru RPG, Dungeon Masters Guild, and you simply go to thegaminggang.com, click on one of our banners, and that will actually utilize the affiliate code. Of course, you can also make a one-time donation by way of PayPal or become a monthly member of our Patreon. You'll find links in the show notes. Also, in those show notes, you're going to find an invite link to our Discord server, which is absolutely free for you to sign up for. So be sure to hang with the gang over on Discord. Today, I'll be sharing my review of Dungeons & Dragons Heroes of the Borderlands starter set from Wizards of the Coast. This box set is arriving in stores on September 16th. It carries an MSRP of $49.99. You can also get the Ultimate Bundle over at D&D Beyond, which includes the box set as well as the digital edition for $54.99. Having said all that, let's swing out over to the other camera because here I've got the Dungeons & Dragons Heroes of the Borderlands starter set. A few things to mention before we get stuck in. First of all, the fine folks over at Wizards of the Coast were kind enough to provide me with this review copy, but neither I nor anyone else affiliated with the Gaming Gang has received any other sort of compensation for me to share this review with you. Very important, you know that. We're also not going to look at each and every card, each and every page of the booklets which are inside, but I do want to give you a really good feel for what you're going to find inside the starter set. And then there are adventure booklets. So if you're a player and your dungeon master has placed an order for this, maybe they're talking about picking up this starter set, maybe you've got friends who are talking about picking this up, maybe you've never played a role-playing game in your life. If you're going to be a player, not the dungeon master, I got to warn you, there are going to be some spoilers. Now, they aren't going to be earth-shattering spoilers, but there are going to be some spoilers ahead. So keep in mind, some of the surprises of the adventures might be ruined by some of these spoilers. All right, first thing we're going to do is take a peek to see what is in this box. And I got to say, there is quite a lot. First off, we've got a set of dice. Strangely enough, I never see starter sets that have multiple sets of dice. That would be perfect, wouldn't it? Of course, it would raise the price of starter sets, but still. Gotta say, I love the fact that we have 4 6-sided dice. We also have 2 20-sided dice, because you are going to have advantage and disadvantage, which requires 2 20-sided dice, and you are going to utilize more than 1 6-sided die a hell of a lot. It doesn't matter what role-playing game you're utilizing. The vast majority use more than 1 6-sided die. So here's a tip for the dice companies out there. When you create a set of dice, put in multiple 6-sided dice, please. Because nothing looks worse than having a really cool set of dice and you have 1 6-sided die, and the game master says, okay, I need you to roll 3 6-sided dice. And you're like, okay, I'm going to take this cool die and a couple of white dice with black pips. There you go. Just saying. So kudos to Wizards of the Coast for continuing to include 4 6-sided dice and 2 20-sided dice in their sets. Very nicely done. I also want to say, as far as starter sets go, and I have reviewed a lot over the years, Heroes of the Borderlands actually contains the most content out of any that I've actually reviewed. That's saying quite a bit, because there are some companies out there that make phenomenal starter sets, such as Chaosium Inc., Free League Publishing, Paizo Inc. with their beginner box for Pathfinder. This has got loads more in it. Now, I will also mention that this does have an MSRP of $49.99. Most starter sets across the industry run somewhere between $29.99 and $39.99. There are some exceptions here and there, but the vast majority, it's between $30 and $40. So this is a little bit more, but there is a lot packed in here. We will get magic item cards because we have class boards that the players are going to use. So they're actually going to have cards for their equipment, for their spells, items, things like that. So they're going to utilize these cards on these mats, these boards. And of course, we will get an image of the item and then a breakdown of what that is. I'll talk a little more about magic items as we get into the adventures. So we've got quite a few of those. We've got a bunch of spell cards. And one of the things that I really like about this starter set too is if multiple characters could possibly have something, you will have multiple copies of that card. Love that. So as an example, there's the keep on the Borderlands. Now you can receive a tabard for the Borderlands keep. Well, there are 4 cards because there are 4 pre-generated characters in this box. So I like that. A lot of different cards here. And then, of course, we get the relevant information about the spells. Same goes for our equipment. As you can see, this is a big deck of cards here. Of course, this includes items as well as weapons and armor and such. As long as it's not magical, it will be in this deck of cards here. We have an NPC deck. So these are relatively minor NPCs that the player characters are going to encounter throughout their adventuring. So we have artwork of each of the characters. Then we get a breakdown of the character. Something I will also point out, it's important for dungeon masters out there running the adventure booklets to have looked at the NPC cards before they start running the adventures, because there are personality traits on these cards. There's information about role-playing these NPCs that you will not find in the adventure booklets. And if you just went by what's in the adventure booklet, these NPCs would be rather bland. So we've got those. We have our ancestries. We have 4 ancestries here. Dwarf, elf, halfling, human. And we have male and female. Then we have our backgrounds. Now, of course, keep in mind, there are far, far more classes and ancestries, backgrounds, and so forth in Dungeons and Dragons. This starter set is just to get you started, to dip your toes in. And we also have some player handouts. We're going to talk about actions as well as combat. So we've got 4 of these. And then we get the monster cards, which I like these a ton. First of all, they're big. Looking at big tarot-sized cards. Artwork is excellent. Now, I know a lot of folks out there are not fond of the art direction of Dungeons and Dragons over the past few years. I got to say, some of the artwork is way too cutesy for my personal taste as well. But you're not seeing any of that with these monster cards. Really nice. Now, we not only get monsters, we will get some of the more important NPCs in here. So with the NPCs that we find in the monster deck, those will maybe take more of a supporting role in the adventuring than the NPC cards will. And then, of course, we get all the information that we need regarding these monsters, these NPCs, such as their challenge rating, as well as their stat block. So we get all of their attribute modifiers, positive, negative, whatever. Any special immunities, actions, traits, everything you need is going to be on this card. And as you can see, loads of them. One thing I really love about these monster cards is in the wilderness book, we have some random encountered tables. Those monsters are in here. They're not in any of the actual like statted out encounters, but Even the random encounter table monsters are in here. Love that. So you're going to get a lot of value out of these monster cards. We also get a combat tracker, and the combat tracker is going to make life easier for dungeon masters. Sadly, they're only single-sided. I would have thought maybe they'd be double-sided, but they are not. But we get a pad of those. We get handouts for the player characters. We get Read Me First Quick Start, which just gives you a breakdown. What's in the box? How do you use some of these things? What does the class board look like when you're placing items here? So as you can see, you've got your species, you've got your background, equipment, spell cards, and so forth. We have a bunch of maps, and I've got to say, I don't think I've ever seen a starter set with as many maps. These are all dual-sided. And we'll just randomly take one. I like the style of the maps. Now, granted, they don't have a photorealistic look to them, but I do dig it. I like it. Almost has an animated look to it, or cartoonish look. And as I mentioned, dual-sided. I will talk about the encounter maps when we start talking about adventures, because I got to be honest, although I really like these mats, I probably would not utilize them the way that it's explained in the booklets. Just so you know, like I said, I'll get to that in just a bit. Here are our class boards. So we have pre-generated characters. There are no rules for character generation in the starter set. That's pretty much par for the course with role-playing game starter sets. There are some exceptions, including the brand new Castles and Crusades starter set, which I will be reviewing in the not too distant future. But for the most part, you usually get pre-generated characters, and that's what we're seeing here. Now, as far as these class boards go, we have level 1, level 2, and then we will have 2 choices for your level 3, because that's when a player gets to choose that character's subclass. These are just paper stock. I mean, they're not real light paperweight, but these are not card stock, like thick card stock by any stretch. So we got the cleric, we got the fighter, we got the rogue, we got the wizard. And once again, these are pre-gens, so we've got all of our attribute modifiers or ability modifiers all right here. Some other information that you need, such as, okay, playing a wizard. Well, why would you want to play a wizard? Well, you play a wizard if you want to be the sort of character who does this. So we've got all of that. We also have some punch boards, power tokens, hit points, gem tokens, gold pieces. I will mention some of the marketing materials for Heroes of the Borderlands has presented this as a board game, and there are serious aspects of board games in here, but this is still a role-playing game. I don't know if it's just being marketed that way to maybe entice board gamers to check out Dungeons and Dragons. Maybe that's the case. We do have some player tokens. These are standees. If you have plastic stands that would hold them, I definitely recommend that, because these little tabs, they tend to wear these things out really quickly. We do have a couple of punch boards of monster tokens. Strangely, we have standees for the player characters, tokens for the monsters. Personally, I would have liked to have seen Dungeons and Dragons go the way of pawns, like standees. I do understand why we've got the tokens. Yes, virtual tabletops, interchangeable, still looks the same. Oh, hey, that's the same token in D&D Beyond. All right, cool. I get it. Personally, I just think it looks better with the standees. I think visually it looks cooler. But we've got that. So very, very well done on those. Nice thick cardstock on those. It's not real thin either. Then we move into the booklets. So we got the play guide, which clocks in at 31 pages. 31 pages. In fact, first of all, let's take a look at the credits page here. I think this is the credits for everybody as far as all the booklets. I think that's the case here. We'll double check, but if I remember correctly, I think this is the only credits page I encountered. But then again, once again, like I said, I could be wrong. So this is going to break down how do you play Dungeons and Dragons in 31 pages. And I have got to say that this does a phenomenal job of introducing Dungeons and Dragons to people who have never played a role-playing game in their life. Maybe they've seen some actual play videos. Maybe they've been enticed somehow into checking out Dungeons and Dragons because, hey, there's a starter set. It's the perfect way to onboard into the system. I'm telling you right now, if you're a player and you read this, you will know everything you need to know to play Dungeons and Dragons. Now, of course, does it have everything that the player's handbook has? No, obviously it does not. For one, you only have the 4 classes. We get a handful of the species, ancestries, I like to refer to them as. We only have a handful of the backgrounds, but still, all the information you need as far as the mechanics of the game as a player are laid out for you very, very nicely. We have a glossary that breaks down important concepts and keywords as well. Very, very nicely done. This is top notch. This really is. As a dungeon master, little trickier because you're not going to encounter a lot of information about how do you run Dungeons and Dragons. Now, we do have the adventure booklets, which kind of touch on that, but they don't take a deep dive into what it means to be a dungeon master. So at this point, no joke, I would be giving the starter set a 10 out of 10. It is that good. I am so impressed by the cards. Love the fact, I know I'm going to harp on this again. Love the fact that we've got 4 6-sided dice, 2 20-sided dice with the dice set that's included. Love the fact that as a player, you read through 31 pages, you will have a very, very good grasp on what Dungeons and Dragons is all about as far as playing it. Now, we are going to start taking a look at the adventure booklets, and this is where I think this stumbles quite a bit. We're going to start off with Keep on the Borderlands. I love the fact that Wizards of the Coast is not just giving a nod to the first Dungeons and Dragons adventure that hundreds of thousands of people experienced over the decades as their introduction to D&D, but they've expanded on it a bit. They've changed it a bit. Now, some of those changes are not for the better. So first of all, Keep on the Borderlands is far too clean, far too safe, because the Keep on the Borderlands is supposed to be the last bastion of somewhat civilization in this wilderness. Here, it's like Disney World. Everything's great. Now, yes, I am exaggerating that a little bit, but this is a safe haven. This is a place where you're not going to have to worry about the player characters being attacked or being killed. Now, there are some combat encounters here, but they're not anything that's going to cause a major issue for the player characters. You're not going to see any of these little mini quests that are included in the Keep on the Borderlands book doing a total party kill by any stretch of the imagination. There are some cool things in here. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that all of this is kind of ho-hum. There is an encounter with the guild house where the player characters are being hired by the person in charge to put scrolls in scroll cases. because the person in charge is way, way too busy. I could see really role playing the hell out of this and making it pretty lighthearted, pretty funny, because what it ends up happening is the scrolls are magical and they do not want to be placed in cases. So a battle ensues with the player characters. Like I said, I think it'd be pretty funny, but there is no sense of this is a place that is keeping the monsters at bay. This just feels like it's a place. I honestly think that is a lost opportunity here. And we'll get into a little more of my disappointment with the Wilderness booklet. Now, there are 4 regions in the Wilderness, and the players will receive a wilderness map. Each of the 4 regions have 4 plotted encounters, and they're not very exciting. For the most part, those of you out there who may have played low-level fantasy role-playing game characters in the past, you've seen all this before. These are tropes that have just been exhausted over the years. We got the bandits trying to waylay the player characters along the road. We've got some giant spiders. We have some stuff that's kind of cool. We do have an occult ritual that the player characters can interrupt or they can take part in. I thought was kind of interesting. But for the most part, all in all, really nothing that pushes the envelope whatsoever as far as adventuring. And that is one of the issues that I have with more modern Dungeons and Dragons is I don't get that sense of wonder. And that is really what should be at the forefront of Dungeons and Dragons adventuring is, wow, I never even imagined something like that. Whereas what we're seeing here is, oh yeah, I've seen that before. I saw that in a video game. And I get it. Gamers out there are far, far more jaded than when I started playing Dungeons and Dragons when I was in grade school. And actually, I think it was about 77, 70. It must have been about 78 when I was first introduced to Dungeons and Dragons. And if you wanted fantasy, if you wanted science fiction, sure, okay. Star Wars had come out, and I think Battlestar Galactica was beginning. But for the most part, we weren't inundated with all of this fantasy or science fiction as far as our movies and our television. If you wanted that, you had to pick up a book. And you receive that sense of wonder by reading some of the classic authors out there. Like I said, I feel like it's kind of lost with new Dungeons and Dragons. And like I said, these wilderness encounters are bland for the most part. Like I said, there are a handful. They're pretty interesting. Funny enough, I think the random encounter tables here at the end are actually more interesting than some of these plotted ones. I know, kind of weird. So that is the Wilderness book. And then our final booklet is the Caves of Chaos. And I will say the original Keep on the Borderlands, the Caves of Chaos made absolutely 0 sense. All these caves scattered around in a fairly limited area with all these different sorts of monsters who seemingly aren't aware of each other. And it was a real hodgepodge. That hasn't changed. I'm kind of surprised. But the Caves of Chaos is going to be pretty heavy into combat. One thing I will say about the adventure booklets, we do have situations where the player characters can avoid combat by parlay or by maybe coming up with a clever idea. I like that because far, far too many, especially third-party Dungeons and Dragons products out there, it's just combat encounter after combat encounter after combat encounter. And that's not how Dungeons and Dragons should be. Now, I'm not the sort of person who's going to tell you the right or wrong way to play a game, but I certainly would not enjoy spending a session 3 to 4 hours of all we did is fight something, move along, fight something else. Every area, every room we walk into, got to fight something. That is thankfully not the case here. But once again, as I mentioned, a lot of this just doesn't make a whole hell of a lot of sense. So I'll give you an example. We've got a goblin cave, and the goblin leader is celebrating their birthday. So when the player characters make their way into this cave, all the goblins are all smeared with cake and things like that, which, okay, I'm going to say back when I got involved with Dungeons and Dragons, if there was a goblin birthday party, they would have all been hammered on ale, not sitting there eating cake. And the reality is, if I were to be running the Caves of Chaos today, I would still make it where they were drunk on ale, probably stolen from somebody's wagon, some merchant's wagon, because in the wilderness, the player characters do find an abandoned wagon with still that has some gear in it. So that's one of the things that's kind of like, okay, seems odd that that's the case, because even the description of them says they're violent goblins. It's right there, the first 2 sentences about this cave, and then they're just all hanging out eating cake. But I will also point out that there is a way for the player characters to avoid having to fight all the goblins, and it's pretty clever. I think it's fairly obvious that the players will catch on. But as far as that cave goes, that cave leads to a couple of other caves, and it's as if the other monsters aren't really aware of the goblins. And it's like, but your cave leads into that cave. Although there are entrances and exits outside of the connection, but still, it just feels weird. Now, there is kind of a mention that the hobgoblins could be aware of the goblins. If you wanted to make the encounter more dangerous for the player characters, you can introduce some hobgoblins hanging out. But for the most part, no. But that was the case with Caves of Chaos from Dungeons and Dragons originally. So I can't really fault this adventure booklet too much. There is a group of cultists who have a cave, and there is this chaos bell. I, as a dungeon master, would probably utilize that as a plot point, which that's what's drawing some of these monsters to this system of caves, as opposed to, well, they just showed up one day. Now, I don't want to imply that every one of these locations is sort of like, nah. There are some cool things going on. There is the ogre and the red dragon wormling that are allies by necessity. They don't really care for each other, especially the ogre disliking the wormling. The Minotaur cave is cool. I like the cultist cave, but some of these are just sort of, okay, all right. Other odd things about the adventures. Remember, I mentioned we've got the magic item deck. Well, when there's a magic item to be found, you're supposed to shuffle up the deck and just take out a treasure and be like, okay, that's what you found. Some of that would not make much sense. So there is an NPC who's been captured, and they supposedly hid a magic item before they were captured. Well, we have magic plate mail in here. So are you trying to tell me that this character stripped out of their plate mail and then hid it in, I believe it's a barrel, before they got captured? A little odd. I would probably, as the dungeon master, take a peek, say, okay, you know what? The Cloak of Billowing would probably be a good find here. Or maybe if you needed to shuffle cards up, select 3 cards and then pick what you think might be most appropriate. That has too much of a board game sort of vibe to the proceedings. Just, oh, here's a random card that you received. Strangely enough, this is marketed in some ways as a board game. And there are parts of the design of this starter set that does come across as a board game, shuffling those up and just dealing out random magic items is one of them. So the adventure booklets themselves, they're okay. They're not knocking my socks off by any stretch of the imagination. And yes, I'm sure folks out there are going to be, well, Jeff, you've been reviewing role-playing games for over 12 years now. Gaming Gang's been around for 15 years. You started tackling role-playing games after you guys started. And I've been running role-playing games for over 40 years. You're jaded. Of course, this is all going to come across as being kind of par for the course. Not necessarily. Now, you might recall I reviewed The Wild Beyond the Witchlight for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons and absolutely loved it because it did have kind of a fairy tale vibe, and it did really have a lot of wonderment built into the various different encounters in that. Now, I know a lot of people out there disliked that adventure campaign because there were so many ways for the player characters to avoid combat. So yeah, and that appeals to me. Anyway, so we've got the Caves of Chaos, we've got the Wilderness, we've got the Keep on the Borderlands, and we had the Play Guide. And once again, up until we got into the adventure booklets, this was 10 out of 10. So let's swing on over to the other camera so I can share some final thoughts as well as my review score. Taken as a whole, this starter set is a fantastic introduction to Dungeons & Dragons for people who have 0 to very little experience with role-playing games, not just Dungeons & Dragons, but role-playing games in general. I would say this is also a really nice reintroduction for those out there who maybe they played D&D years and years ago when they were in high school or in college. Maybe they've got kids and maybe they want to introduce that to their children, or maybe you're an adult and your kids are asking you, hey, Mom, Dad, could we play Dungeons and Dragons? I always hear all this stuff about Dungeons and Dragons. Or maybe you watch actual play videos and just have never actually played. I think this does a marvelous job of introducing the game to players. Where it stumbles is actually in the adventures themselves and the presentation to the dungeon master. Now, everything is laid out. There's a lot of hand-holding going on. In fact, there's a lot of redundancies in the adventure booklets as far as how do you use this adventure booklet and so on and so forth. Almost as if the dungeon master would only have maybe one of the booklets with them when they were running the Heroes of the Borderlands campaign, which would make absolutely no sense at all. You would no doubt have all of the booklets with you because you are going to have the player characters return to the keep because that's the only place they can do a long rest. So some of the redundancy is unwarranted. And the adventures themselves, yes, there are some cool set pieces. There are some fun encounters that I know I would have a blast role-playing as a dungeon master, and especially getting my gang really involved in it. I guarantee they would get a massive kick out of. But for the most part, they don't provide the sense of wonder that, in my opinion, not only Dungeons and Dragons, but any fantasy role-playing game really needs to impart on its players. Now, a lot of that's going to have to do with the dungeon master. But seeing that this is a starter set introducing people to Dungeons and Dragons, that should have been the responsibility of the adventure designers as opposed to the dungeon masters in training. I think one of the issues which has plagued most of the more recent Dungeons and Dragons adventure releases is the fact that there's so many freelancers contributing to the various different books, or in this case, we've got booklets, especially looking at some of the adventure releases for 5e from Wizards of the Coast. You had 30 or more freelancers all working on one adventure campaign. That's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. And I am not trying to force people out of work by any stretch of the imagination. But usually when you have that many contributors to an adventure campaign, there's a lot of disconnection. It doesn't feel organic. It feels like a lot of things are just pasted here, posted there. And that's how these adventure booklets feel as well. There isn't a through line that makes this feel connected. We've got the keep, we've got the wilderness, we got the caves of chaos, but they don't come together as a whole. And once again, they don't provide that sense of wonderment. They're not terrible. I don't want you to think that. There are some encounters, there are some set pieces that are fun, and I could see role-playing the hell out of as a dungeon master, and I guarantee my players would have a blast with, but there aren't enough of them in these adventure booklets. So if you are looking to pick up Heroes of the Borderlands as an introduction to Dungeons and Dragons, outside of the adventures, it's excellent. Like I said, it's like a 10 out of 10. It is that good. Once we introduce the adventure booklets, that does drag down the overall review score. So on a scale of 0 to 10, I give Dungeons and Dragons Heroes of the Borderlands starter set an 8 out of 10. Certainly recommend it, especially to those who are looking for an introduction to Dungeons and Dragons. If you are relatively familiar with D&D, even Dungeons and Dragons 2024, this probably isn't really essential to pick up, especially since the Keep, the Caverns, as well as the Wilderness books are just okay. All right, that is it for this time out. If you like this video, by all means, please give it a quick thumbs up. Subscribe to the Gaming Gang channel if you haven't already, and if you do subscribe, don't forget, ring that bell, because it'll not only let you know when I share videos such as this review, it'll also inform you when my live stream, the Gaming Gang Dispatch, airs Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday evenings right here on YouTube at 7 p.m. Central. Of course, when you're not watching videos here on the Gaming Gang channel, be sure to visit thegaminggang.com for all latest in tabletop gaming news, reviews, and a whole lot more you are not going to find here on YouTube. You know the drill. Get your geek on at thegaminggang.com. Once again, I'm Jeff McAleer. Thank you very much for watching. And until I see you next time, certainly hope all of you get to enjoy plenty of great gaming with your gang.